Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the opening convocation of 2015, and please be seated. Faculty, staff, students, and friends, and alumni and parents watching online, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you formally to our opening convocation. You will soon hear from the university singers and our speaker, Brian Murchison, but first it is my solemn and sacred duty to declare the academic year officially underway. Although I'm confident you have all gone ahead anyway, without the benefit of grand proclamations, law school is well into its fall semester, with the 1Ls already speaking fluent legalese and projecting a sense of authority and confidence unimaginable 2 weeks ago. And hopefully the propensity to launch into adversarial argument on a moment's notice will take a while to develop. On the undergraduate side, seniors are facing the harsh reality that each day brings another last. The last fall semester, the last requirement for a major, the last class with a favorite professor, the last opening game, the last September as an undergraduate. As I mentioned to a few of you seniors the other day, I'll be right there with you in mutual commiseration. As the year unfolds, we'll consider each other peer counselors. For the first year undergraduates, a special welcome to Washington and Lee. Your arrival brings more to the campus than you realize. Strange as it may seem, we can already easily imagine you as seniors approaching your last year. Even more strange, perhaps, we can imagine you well into your careers and your lives, ones that will make us proud for having played a part. Your presence is a vivid reminder why we do what we do. We welcome you as another class of bright individuals we have the privilege to teach. This is typically the moment when I turn to the university singers. Their selection for this year's opening convocation, the Lake Isle, requires, however, some context, which our Associate Provost and the Joe M. and James Ballingy Professor of English, Mark Connor, will provide, as only he can, for reasons that will be obvious to those who know him and can be inferred by those who don't. Mark Connor.
I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. This is a poem about a journey. It starts with leave taking. I will arise and go, and with a destination, and go to Innisfree. And this raises two immediate questions. Why is he leaving, and where is he going? It's a poem that imagines a place of absolute peace and harmony, a small cabin, nothing grand or imposing, bean rows, honeycomb. It evokes a simple life of easily satisfied desires. And what is the reward of those desires? Peace. And I shall have some peace there. And at the thought of that long-desired peace, the poetry expands. Here are the longest lines of the poem, as if language and imagination are quickened by the evocation of that place of peace. For peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings, there midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. William Butler Yeats wrote this poem. He was an Irish poet who lived in the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of his birth this year, and there are commemorations and celebrations throughout Ireland for their greatest poet. But Yeats wrote this poem in London as a young man. He was only 25 when he wrote Innisfree, living in London but always longing for his childhood home in County Sligo in the north of Ireland. There Yeats walked the hills, forests, and glens as a child, hearing stories from his nurse about the fairies and the enchanted landscape all around him. The Lake Isle of Innisfree is a small island in the middle of Loch Gill, near Yeats's childhood home. But now he was a young adult living in the big city, far from that lovely home, And one day he was walking down the London streets, and he looked in a shop window and saw a fountain, and he says, "I began to remember lake water. From the sudden remembrance came my poem, Innisfree." So we have to imagine Yeats on the cold streets of London, longing for home, seeing water in a shop window, and being transported back to the landscape of his childhood, a realm of magic, beauty, and peace. This, then, is a poem that longs to go back home, certainly an experience that many a college student will have, whether in her first week on the new campus or at other moments during the college season. Yet notice that the poem does not end with Yeats returning to that childhood home. It starts with, "I will arise and go now," and it ends with, "I will arise and go now." But he hasn't gone. We might expect the last stanza to show the poet returning to that idealized childhood landscape, but instead he is still in London, still on the pavement's gray, and the place of peace and beauty remains only in his mind. "I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core." I absolutely love that final line. And notice how here the poetry does not grow and expand, it contracts into just 7 clipped one-syllable words. I hear it in the deep heart's core. What does this suggest? Does Yeats's memory and his inability to return to that idealized home somehow constrict his poetic voice? Is art frustrated by desire? Recall that initial question of this poem. Why is he leaving and where is he going? This question is frustrated by the fact that he doesn't leave, so he doesn't get there. But perhaps he does. It's an interesting fact that the actual Lake Isle of Innisfree is a tiny place. It could barely support 1 or 2 bean rows, not the 9 that Yeats envisions. And the small cottage he dreams of would hardly fit on this hill in a lake. For the fact is, the isle that Yeats imagines is precisely that, a place of his imagination. Were he to actually go there, he would be sorely disappointed. It is more real to him as an imagined place than it could ever be as a real place. And perhaps that is what home finally becomes for us all. The home our first years have left behind, and for which perhaps you long right now, is vanishing into the stuff of childhood. And the home that our seniors might right now be imagining, a future home as yet unrealized, must first be conceived in the imagination for it to become a reality. Where does home exist, and toward what destination do our journeys take us? For Yeats, the true reality and the ultimate home exists within us. Our journeys ultimately take us back to our beginnings. We hear the call of home, and we seek it throughout our lives, only to find that it is with us all the time in the deep heart's core.
Thank you to the university singers and to Mark Connor. See if you can guess where their spring break trip is going to be this year. The faculty at Washington and Lee are an uncommonly gifted group of individuals. They know their subjects well, yet they are creative enough to question the accepted wisdom in their field and make their own distinctive contributions. They are engaged in learning themselves and are not so infected with hubris that they consider the granting of their degrees the conclusion of their studies. They know it is a privilege and a deeply fulfilling vocation to be with people like our students. Generation after generation, students who make us proud while they are here, but even more proud when they leave the campus to contribute to their professions and their communities. But what truly sets our faculty apart is their deep dedication to individual students, to finding within each of them the spark of an interest and then nurturing it into a lifelong passion. Brian Murchison, our speaker today, personifies the highest qualities of the profession and the highest qualities of a Washington and Lee faculty member. After graduating from Yale in 1974, Professor Murchison served 2 years in Benin, West Africa with the Peace Corps. And he and his wife, Anne, to this day, maintain an ongoing affection for the people they came to know in that part of the world. He then returned to Yale for law school. After receiving his law degree, he joined a law firm in Washington, D.C., but he soon found himself on the law faculty at W&L in 1982. And he has remained here his entire professional career, to the considerable benefit of the university as well as the law school. Professor Murchison is a scholar of the First Amendment and free speech, one of the cornerstones of our democracy, but also one of the most contentious and complex areas of constitutional law. In 2002, he was named the Charles S. Rowe Professor of Law. He earned combat pay by serving as acting law dean during the 2006-2007 academic year. A deeply respected colleague, an inspirational teacher, a distinguished scholar, and a generally all-around decent guy. Professor Murchison personifies our highest qualities. Join me in welcoming him to the podium for the opening convocation address.
Thank you. My wife Ann and I say that convocation is that moment in between summer and fall, in between the tasty gelato of vacation and the black coffee of the semester. In between making of plans and carrying them out. Convocation is our chance to converge on this exceptional spot, to salute the students who are new, to treasure the community that is Washington and Lee, and also to salute the seniors and third years who will be leaving us at the end of this year. You know, the convocations that are clearest in my memory are the ones where the speakers selected some aspect of Washington and Lee that reflected a tradition or a value of the place. A couple years ago, our late colleague Pam Simpson chose the colonnade. She talked about how that extraordinary facade, that pathway, came to be, how a physical campus emerged over time. The product of new visions building on old. So that it was seen finally as representing a disposition of mind, a commitment to knowledge and to character. And 2 years ago, Professor Goldsmith talked about interdisciplinary explorations and scholarly collaboration between students and teachers as key strains of what goes on here at W&L. And last year, President Ruscio reflected on university history, and then more broadly on the role of a university and a democracy, its participation in the search for truth and the spirit of free inquiry. So today, like them, I've got a specific object of attention that I hope can illustrate something larger about the school. This academic year, we mark the 20th anniversary of a program in the law school, the Black Lung Clinic, a fixture appropriately enough in the bowels of the building of Lewis Hall, in which each year a band of students works with a professor to learn a body of law and to represent clients, coal miners from Beckley and Scarborough, West Virginia. How did this program come to be? How has it lasted 20 years? My story is about how study can open the mind, how vocation can arise from that opening, how collaboration can enrich service, what these things say about the liberal arts at W&L. For you know, the spirit of the liberal arts connects all three units of the university, the college, the Williams School, the law school. It's a spirit that binds us together in energetic pursuit of knowledge, including that process of questioning and discovering the meaning, the worth of things, the process of considering what it means to be human, what it can be like to hear a calling, and begin to share responsibility for somebody else's welfare. So the story begins when a long-time W&L professor, one who'd gone here undergrad and to law school, taught a class in the early 1990s with a great title, Lawyering for Social Change. This was Professor Andrew Uncas McPhenia, who had grown up in West Virginia, had witnessed the social upheaval there in the 1960s over safety and health in the mines. Much of the class he taught was spent delving into that time and place, into the details that gave rise to a vocal politics and kind of uncertain change. As a younger member of the faculty, I snuck in the back door and kind of took it all in, his class. We studied a series of underground explosions that had occurred in mines near Farmington, West Virginia. Over 10 days, in the autumn of 1969, 78 miners died. And in the months that followed, voices across the country saying, how could that have happened? What did happen? Soon enough, the press arrived and discovered other problems of Appalachian mining, especially lung disease caused by exposure to the coal mine dusts. It turned out that risks of breathing dust, fibrosis, emphysema, were far from unknown. But they've been pretty much ignored by a lot of people, by industry, by the union, by state public health officials, by federal public health officials since the turn of the century. The class, Professor McPhenie's class, we tried to grasp this neglect and what it meant. But there had been a turning point when Farmington happened. And in March 1969, some 40,000 miners across the state of West Virginia just stopped working, insisting that attention be paid. A march took place in the state capitol that Charleston had never seen the likes of before. By December 1969, the Congress, and the U.S. Congress and the U.S. President had passed legislation that created a national program to compensate miners who had dust disease from the mines and as a result were disabled from working. The miner would have to prove that he had the disease and its source, but if he did, he could receive workers' compensation, and that was something. And he'd receive it from his coal company employer. Now, the employer could challenge the claim, and administrative law judges of the Department of Labor would be the judges. But it seemed that after long years of hostility between those sides in the state, that there was a new workable program, and that something good would come of it. But Professor McPhenie invited some speakers to his class who said that 25 years later, the problem of dust exposure and black lung disease had not gone away. Why? One reason stood out. The miners lacked the resources to get lawyers and to get medical experts to help improve their claims. And the other side had lawyers and had experts to disprove the claims, or to at least dispute them. The stark reality was that in the 1990s, the miners were losing 90% at the time. That was just not acceptable. That's not what Congress thought when they passed the legislation. The semester ended on that melancholy note. And for those of us who had experienced the class, it was hard not to feel that justice, however you define it, had not yet arrived in the coal fields. Liberal arts learning can be like this. You can start with an intensive study of facts or ideas, the encounter with the reality of a time or a place, and that can stick in your mind. And sometimes when the class is done and the semester's over, it's not really done, it's not really over. Liberal arts experience can haunt a student whose mind has been open even a crack. We were haunted. Okay, so the rest of the story is about how W&L created a legal clinic. Professor McPhenie, I see you. You took a few of the faculty over to coal country and you introduced them to an inspiring group of miners who really wanted some change. And they said, welcome, help us. That day, that group from W&L also met a legendary doctor who'd spent his career treating miners with breathing disorders. An amazing man. And that group from W&L also met a lay advocate over there who had come to Beckley as a young VISTA volunteer 20 years before and had never left. And there were miners in their 40s, 50s, 60s who were proud of their work in the mines underground. They'd worked hard. They were proud of what they had done. But the problem was they were using supplemental oxygen. They couldn't breathe. And on the way back to Lexington that night, the W&L group was talking about how a legal aid clinic might not only help the miners, but the students here. The group had picked up on one of Professor McFeeney's pet words, vocation. In doing this sort of work, might at least a few of our students get a taste of what a vocation is, what a calling is. Professor McFeeney defined a calling as something that happens when you realize your life is really not your own. That made us think. Could the students learn something more about the complexity and variety of life if they had to see the world, at least for a semester, through the prism of the coalfield? Could they learn how to work positively in an imperfect system? That's hard. Could they learn how to work patiently within and try to reform something? That's hard. Some even remembered a speech that they'd read long ago made by Dr. Laber, years before at an ODK celebration, where he had urged the students towards what he called enlargement of mind and spirit. And some of us remembered Professor Sidney Cowling's speech in Lee Chapel, when he had talked about the social mission of the humanities. But setting up an office like that wasn't going to happen overnight. The challenge was immense. It had to be the integrative methodology of the liberal arts education to make it happen. First, historical, cultural grounding would be important. The students had to know that history that Professor McFeeney had taught. But they had to know some sociology. They had to know something about the culture. They had to know something about the economics that had partially created some of the problems. Second, the students' legal knowledge had to be intense and exhaustive. They'd have to grasp the details of the law, master the precedents, understand the role of all the players. Third, they'd have to understand the lung. The lungs. I think you have to. How it works when it's healthy. What happens when it's not. As if all this were not enough, the students would have to develop their ability to communicate with minors, with the doctors, with the bureaucrats, with the judges, with the opposing attorneys. They'd have to learn how to say no to some of the minors who didn't qualify for the disability. They'd have to learn how to say no to them. We can't represent you. And they'd learn how to say yes and really mean it to the people we were going to represent. And they'd finally have to learn the importance of clear expression in the courtroom and on the written page. Well, to learn the workings of the lung, the students were assisted by this lady, Professor Simerna, of the biology department, who shared her knowledge of the lung and all of its facets. Every fall, she crossed that bridge, came over to Lewis Hall to instruct the law students in how dust gets in there and stays and does damage. She also began to supervise one of her undergraduate students every year to review the latest medical literature on the lung, the latest stuff, and to present that research to the law students and the supervising professor. Not simply to present it, but to explain it and to explain its vulnerabilities if there were any. Over the years, these sessions of critical analysis proved to be rich moments in the history of the law school's partnership with the sciences at W&L. And physics professor Tom Williams, who I think is here, he also was involved in at least one of our cases, consulting on the question of comparing x-ray evidence to autopsy evidence. We didn't know about that. He helped us. The legal precedents had to be put to the same analysis under the supervision of Professor Mary Natkin. And those of us, including Professor Jim Femister, who were her fellow teachers, the students discovered what had concerned those judges that had come to Professor McNeely's class, that the existing system wasn't exactly due process, wasn't exactly fair play. The challenge wasn't just getting lawyers. The challenge was that one side could produce a stack of evidence this high, and the other side only had the resources to produce evidence this high. Well, actually, that high. Well, in researching the law, the students figured out that a W&L alumnus had written perhaps one of the two key opinions of the Supreme Court of the United States on due process in a disability context, Lewis Powell. And we got the W&L librarian and archivist, John Jacob, to lead us into that archive and open the files and kind of dig out what Lewis Powell had been thinking when he wrote a decision about fair play in a disability hearing, what it's all about. And there was trenchant discussion among the students sitting around the table about due process as a concept, as an American concept. What about the art of advocacy? Some learning had to be done there too. The then dean of the law school was a guy named Barry Sullivan. He'd been a partner at Jenner and Block in Chicago. He knew something about advocacy, all right? He had worked in the Justice Department. He knew something about advocacy. And his approach was what he called the ethics of advocacy. And he defined that as a process that aims to elicit honest judgment by the decision makers. And he would leave the lordly domains of the dean's office and come down to the bowels every once in a while of the law school and sit around with us and talk about advocacy and talk about establishing a reputation to be as good lawyers, as honest lawyers, as ethical lawyers. Also how to rebound from mistakes, how to deal with defeat, how to keep learning and perfecting skills through good times and bad. All right, even with all that, sometimes we ask ourselves if we really knew the culture that we were interacting with. What did Harper Lee say? You never really understand a person. Until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin, walk around it. Well, one way of climbing into the skin of a place and a people is through literature. And Uncas McNeely brought a novelist over from Bluefield. Wrote stories about resistance. And Suzanne Keene sent over poems by Muriel Rukeyser, an American woman poet who wasn't from the coal fields, but had gotten there somehow and had been moved by it and had written poems about it. And one of them went like this: "These roads will take you into a landscape mirrored in these men, past all your influences, your home river, past the constellation of cities and the mottos of your childhood. Parents and easy cures, all of evasion's wishes." Yeah, I think she was saying that the coal fields had awakened a sense of urgency in her, and that somehow she was getting beyond her previous influences and maybe her previous complacency. I don't know. What could a poem mean to a clinic? Well, it could give words to the newness of the experience, a little courage when the going was getting tough and we couldn't win a case. We never quoted Muriel Rukeyser in a brief, but I'll tell you, she was an invisible companion there. Which brings me to a final thought: writing. The clinical experience was an engagement with writing. Not just things we had read, but sentences we had to write. Lawyers are writers primarily, aren't we? Yes. And writing is, we'll all agree, the most difficult task. There's a book out by Fareed Zakaria, the CNN commentator in defense of the liberal arts, and he puts it this way, quote, "When you hear someone extol the benefits of liberal education, you will probably hear him say that it teaches you how to think." And he went on, "I'm sure that's true, but for me, the central virtue of a liberal education is that it teaches you how to write. and writing makes you think. Whatever you do in life, the ability to write clearly, he wrote, to write cleanly and reasonably quickly will prove to be an invaluable skill. That's what Zacharias said. In the clinic for almost each of our clients, there was a brief to be written, sometimes 20 pages, sometimes 50. Bringing together the facts, the data, the medicine, the law, shaped with force but not melodrama, providing a judge a reason but not an exaggerated roadmap to the outcome that we hoped he would reach. A legal brief is an art form, one that takes years to master, and the clinic's lights burned far into the night when a brief was due, believe me. One other thing, when it comes to writing, in some corner of my soul is the voice of a man I learned from when I was in college. His name was William Zinsser. You may have heard of him. He passed away last spring. The New York Times, the New Yorker, all those places posted tributes to him. He was the author of a little volume called On Writing Well. He was a newsman for the New York newspaper world. But when I met him, he was the master of one of the residential houses on the campus of Yale, where I happen to live. And I always considered him one of my teachers. He thought of writing as linked to character. Writing was an expression of self. Sloppy, unfocused writing meant you really hadn't thought through your topic. You really hadn't come to grips with your own thinking, with your own values, your priorities. So late in my senior year, I went knocking on his door. He was a slight man with a very open face, and he could make you feel welcome just by opening the door and saying hello. I went to him with a small dilemma. What should I do with my life? I was a month away from graduating. I had a couple of possible things I could do. I was all torn up. Sort of like that sloppy writer who hadn't come to grips with his topic. This gentleman heard me out and answered me with a question. He said, which of these things would present the most challenge? And then he said, which of these things would expand the community that you're a member of? It took me a while to process that. And I suppose that's always the question of the liberal arts. Where can you best enlarge your mind? How can you best expand the community you're a member of? How can you get beyond what you already know? Of course, that's what writing does. To write a sensible sentence requires understanding your topic, asking questions about it until you've asked the right one to get started. And in the Black Lung Clinic, the act of writing is the vehicle for bringing everything together in coherent, persuasive, good language. So this evening, Convocation, for the year 2015-16, we look forward to the 20th birthday of the clinic, which I think of as a product of liberal arts, collaboration at its best. So come over. If you come over to Lewis Hall, you'll see 8 or 9 students in that office down there in the bowels, superbly supervised by Professor McDonald. You may hear them talking about the workings of the lung, all the stuff that goes on in there, or is supposed to go on, but doesn't some of the time. And you'll hear them talking about emphysema and alveoli and all those words. Or you might hear them arguing about whether a recent court case is good for their cases or bad. You might witness a run-through of the next day's argument in court. You might even overhear a discussion about finding one's calling, what to do about that realization that your life really isn't your own. If you come across any of those things, I suggest that what you hear is the liberal arts in action, the liberal arts in practice. You might also be hearing an echo of that poet who invites us to think independently, to think creatively, and even an echo of Mr. Zinster, who counseled, look for that challenge. Embrace it, go beyond what you know. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. What a perfect beginning for the academic year, and for you first-year students and Winnells, what a perfect beginning for your academic career and beyond. As the university singers take their position, let me ask you all to rise for the singing of the university hymn. Thank you again to the university singers. You can remain standing. It will only take me a minute or two to send us on our way into our usual routines for the students, the classes, the rehearsals, the athletic contest, for the faculty, the teaching, the work of committees, preparations for a new course, task forces, searches to fill vacant positions, and the grading of assignments and exams, for the facilities management staff, the unending maintenance that makes our grounds and buildings so beautiful, for the dining services, the ongoing task of providing for so many so often, and there are many others, our health and counseling professionals, our public safety officers, the communication staff, the registrar's office. It's a long list, but you get the picture. In the midst of those individual routines, let us not lose sight of the common purpose of this university. What we do here matters, and it is a privilege to be part of such an enterprise. I wish us all well in the year to come. Now, let me just do a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, we acknowledge with thanks the generosity of the class of 1942, whose gift supports this opening convocation each year and contributed to Professor Murchison's considerable honorarium. Second, I thank the dining services staff for the wonderful meal that awaits us, and to avoid chaos, because we feared it was going to rain, and thankfully it did not. But we did have a provision in case just for the dining services, so they had to go ahead and set up. And here's the revised plan. The first-year students and the RAs will go to the marketplace. The faculty the seniors, 3Ls, and other guests will be going to Evans. With that in mind, and in my formal duty as president of Washington and Lee, I officially open the 2015-16 academic year. Have a great year.